Food for All is so pleased today to welcome you to episode 11 of our What the Food webinar series. Food systems are complex. The What the Food series is intended to help us tease out some of its language, concepts, and nuances, and deepen our understanding of it together. Today, we focus on local food and international trade. We'll begin with a presentation from our guest speaker and end with a Q&A. So while you listen, please take note of your thoughts and questions so you can bring them up at the end. Aujourd'hui, on a l'honneur
Today, we have the honor to introduce Suzanne Fournier. Suzanne is the Executive Director of the New Brunswick Farmers Union, an accredited nonprofit agriculture organization. The NBFU promotes policies aimed at revitalizing agriculture in New Brunswick. At the local, national, and international levels, the UNF advocates for alternative structures and government policies that oppose corporate control over food. As part of her duties, she serves on several committees and board of directors, including Canadian Public Markets, Atlantic Food Action Coalition, Living Labs NB, Climate Change Adaptation Collective, Agro Ecosystems NB, Agriculture NB, Farm Talks Care Steering Committee, Farmer Wellness Working Group, Workforce Development Steering Committee, Commodities Advisory Committee, as well as several internal UNF committees. She meets regularly with the Department of Agriculture and provides UNF-NB's input on a range of provincial policies. Suzanne studied political science with a specialization in international relations at Carleton University in Ottawa. She enjoys reading, genealogy, and gardening as much as her chronic illness allows. Passionate about rural communities, she served on a local government reform committee in 2018. She also worked for the New Brunswick Public Library Service until 2020. She has been with UNF-NB for 7 years and lives in Western New Brunswick. Without further ado, I give the floor to Suzanne.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my presentation. Is that showing up for everyone?
Not seeing anything yet, Suzanne.
Here we go.
Perfect.
Good. All right. So I have been asked to talk about local food and international trade. This is a big, complex topic, so I hope what I present is bite-sized, chewable. Before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, Peskamogwittig, and Penobscot peoples as the traditional owners of the land and waterways of the province now known as New Brunswick. Our work occurs on Indigenous land. We pay our respects to Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, Peskamogwittig, and Penobscot elders, past and present, and extend this respect to all other First Nations people who continue to keep country and culture alive in and around the place that is now known as Canada. This photo is of Cecilia Brooks, water grandmother, presenting a culinary demonstration at Hayes Farm at one of our events last year. For over 50 years, the National Farmers Union in Canada has been and continues to be committed to family and collective farms, promoting agroecology and food sovereignty. The NFU vision for farmers, consumers, and the earth is embedded in social and economic justice, both in Canada and internationally. On local, national, and international levels, we advocate for alternative structures and government policies that resist corporate control of food. The NFU, established by an Act of Parliament in 1969, is Canada's largest voluntary direct membership farm organization. We work to promote a food system that is built on a foundation of financially viable small and medium-scale farms that produce high-quality, healthy, safe food. We encourage environmentally sensitive practices that will protect our soil, water, biodiversity, and other natural resources, and promote social and economic justice for food producers and all people living in Canada. The National Farmers Union in New Brunswick is a district in Region 1, which is all of Atlantic Canada, with a separate office and board of directors. We are one of 2 accredited general farm organizations in the province, and we represent about 200 farms of all commodities from all areas. Our goal is to work together to build a sustainable food system and achieve agricultural policies which ensure dignity and security of income for small and medium-scale farms and their families while enhancing the land for future generations. The NFU's work is very broad. Some of the work you may be familiar with here is our NB map of farmers markets, our fight against Bill 75, an amendment to the Mining Act, our workshops for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and our oversight of farm talk care. It is worth noting that while there are national farmers unions in most industrialized nations, each vary from country to country and do not necessarily take the same view or policy on any given subject. I'm going to start this with the word holistic, which will come as no surprise to those on the call who know me. Douglas Adams, the science fiction writer, defines this as the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. In other words, the entirety of something must be considered instead of just considering its parts. The longer I work in agriculture and with the NFU, the harder it is to compartmentalize or dissect any of the work we do. We take a systems-based approach because we can't address the climate crisis without addressing the farm income crisis, without addressing the housing crisis and farmland access. It's all connected. So this presentation will be a little bit eventually tied together and all loop around on itself. I also want to say a note about acronyms. We use them a lot. I will try to say their meaning, but if there's one I miss or you didn't catch, just please put it in the chat and I will try to get to it at the end. I'm going to start with a really brief introduction to food sovereignty, but it will be part of most of the things we talk about today, and I will talk more in depth about it near the end. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define the food and agriculture systems. This doesn't necessarily mean that a country produces 100% of the foods consumed within its borders. Rather, that a country is considered sovereign if most of its food supply, especially basic staples, is produced locally. In advocating for food sovereignty, we don't reject international trade. We think that countries should prioritize providing for their own population. And once local demand has been met, surplus production can be exported. So where did the concept of food sovereignty come from? La Via Campesina. La Via Campesina is a global movement that brings together organizations representing 200 million peasants, small and medium-scale farmers, agricultural, landless, and migrant workers, pastoralists, fishers, rural women, youth, and Indigenous people. It is pluralistic, democratic, multicultural, and nonpartisan. Canada's NFU is a founding member of La Via Campesina, and in 1993, it was built on a sense of unity and solidarity. It defends peasant agriculture for food sovereignty. In the early 1990s, LVC stood opposed to World Trade Organization negotiations around agriculture by calling for the exemption of agriculture and food from talks, and proposed instead its new concept, food sovereignty, as the proper guiding principle. Today, food sovereignty has been embraced around the world, and we say trade deals and food sovereignty don't mix. La Via Campesina insists that diverse, peasant-driven, agroecological modes of production, based on centuries of experience and accumulated evidence, are central to guaranteeing healthy food to everyone, while remaining in harmony with nature. To achieve food sovereignty, La Via Campesina mobilizes and advocates for agrarian reform in peasant territories and provides training on agroecological production methods. LVC and its members focus on issues such as appropriate technology, sustainable agriculture, strengthening women's participation in social, economic, political, and cultural matters, Indigenous, peasants, and farmers' rights, biodiversity, migrant justice, and the promotion of economic relations of equality and social justice. This global coalition is also a platform for its members worldwide to communicate and carry out joint solidarity actions, mobilizations, and campaigns in the defense of land, water, seeds, and forests. Over the last 3 decades, La Via Campesina has successfully found a seat at the table of global institutions of governance, such as the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, and the UN Decade of Family Farming, and more. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2018, resulted from 17 years of negotiations patiently led by La Via Campesina and its allies. This declaration is among the essential international instruments that defend the rights of small-scale food producers and is a crucial tool in the implementation of food sovereignty. I'm going to play a little clip from one of our depth of field films. This is Noidart Farm in Nova Scotia.
I grew up on a dairy farm in the northeast of England, Northumberland, and I just naturally like dairy cows. We came to Noidart in 1998. We came to Canada in 1978. We were lucky enough at that time to be able to afford to buy a dairy farm, which the young ones can't do now.
Supply management certainly was a big factor in that. Initially, we only had 35 cows.
In Breton, yes.
And nowhere else in the world could you make 35 cows and make a living. And supply management gave you that security.
Would you define supply management?
So we're managing the supply to equal the Canadian market, and that's right across Canada. In the short term, what we're doing is producing for a market, and we produce enough for that market, no more, no less. So it produced a guaranteed market at a guaranteed price. Supply management started in the 70s and has evolved somewhat since then, but needs to evolve further now.
These films are all available on the NFU YouTube for free, and they're a 40-film series about farming. Supply management is a unique Canadian institution that provides stability in 5 perishable food sectors by controlling the amount produced, preventing shortages, and keeping underpriced imports from being dumped into our market. As a result, Canada does not experience wide fluctuations in supply and prices, and our system does not require massive government subsidies that are used by other countries to support farmers' incomes in these sectors. Canada's supply management system applies to dairy, broiler chickens, laying hens, turkeys, and hatching eggs across Canada. Each commodity is governed by its own elected provincial marketing board. Supply management was designed to solve multiple problems. Farmers with perishable products like milk were at the mercy of processors who knew they could pressure farmers into accepting lower prices because the alternative was a spoiled product worth nothing. If individual farmers each tried to compensate for low prices by producing more, the result was a market glut which further depressed prices. Often the solution was to dump the excess milk, wasting it. Processors could threaten to refuse delivery and lower prices by encouraging competition among producers, allowing the price to be set by the most desperate farmer. Consumers were subject to price volatility, erratic supplies, and seasonal shortages. It was difficult to ensure consistent quality when farmers couldn't rely on a fair return for their efforts or investment. Supply management system stands on 3 pillars and requires all of them to function together. The first is production discipline, which ensures farmers produce no more or less than the market needs. This is accomplished through the use of quota, which both allows and requires the farmers to produce a specific volume of the product. The total supply needed for each commodity is determined annually based on the previous year's consumption trends, and a share of total quota is allocated to each provincial marketing board for distribution to individual farmers. Each marketing board also decides upon quota exemptions and minimum quota amounts for its province. The second pillar is cost of production pricing, which ensures that farmers receive a fair income. This is accomplished by applying a formula to set the minimum price processors must pay to farmers to cover the cost of running an efficient operation. Cost of production pricing mechanism only applies to farm gate pricing, not grocery store prices. The last pillar is import controls, which provide for predictable and adequate supply. This is accomplished by using tariff rate quotas, which allow a set quantity of a product to be imported at a lower or zero tariff. Once this quota is exceeded, a higher tariff is applied to any additional imports. Tariff rate quotas are often used to shield sensitive sectors such as agriculture and food production from being overwhelmed by cheap imports. The World Trade Organization rules allow countries to restrict or prohibit imports of a product if they do so to enforce government restrictions on the domestic production of the same or similar product. The National Farmers Union supports Canada's supply management system as an important institution of food sovereignty. Corporate concentration is when a small number of companies control the majority of certain markets. You may also know this as consolidation or monopolies. And what I want to stress here is how few multinational corporations control almost all aspects of our food system in Canada. One way to quantify this trend is the 4-firm concentration ratio, which is CR4, refers to the market share of the 4 largest firms in a given sector. If their 4 largest firms' share is less than 40%, a market sector is considered competitive. If the CR4 is above that, anti-competitive behavior can be expected. Unfortunately, most segments of the Canadian food supply chains exceed 40%. And because Canada's system is so integrated with the United States and other global economies, corporate concentration elsewhere is also relevant to us. Also, unfortunately, in Canada, our Competition Bureau does not usually act unless the CR4 is greater than 65%. Corporate concentration also goes hand in hand with vertical integration, and vertical integration is a business strategy where companies control multiple steps of the supply chain. Canada has one of the most concentrated food systems in the industrialized world. I'm going to mention a couple of the sectors with high corporate concentration that are related to agriculture. The input sector, which comprises of chemical and drug manufacturers, energy companies, equipment, feed companies, livestock, fuel, and seeds. Some of these subsectors are highly concentrated, particularly nitrogen fertilizer and ammonia fertilizer. 3 transnational companies, Monsanto, DuPont, and Syngenta, controlled about 53% of global seed sales. And since then, Monsanto has been purchased by Bayer in a move that consolidates control over seeds and pesticides. In each, agrochemical sales, farm machinery sales, and pharmaceutical sales, there are 4 top firms that control 50% or more of the market. Input prices have long been increasing at higher rates than crop prices. Ownerships of farm and farmland is certainly more dispersed than for other parts of the food system, but there are worrying developments. The number of farmers continues to fall, and the number of farms managed by corporations, though still small, continues to rise. There are also 5 major food retailers who dominate the Canadian market: Loblaws, Sobeys, Metro, Costco, and Walmart, respectively. In 2021, these 5 accounted for about 76% or more of grocery sales. Only in Quebec do the independents still hold significant market share, with about 60%, according to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in 2015. Most food comes to retailers from processors and distributors, with a relatively small percentage, mostly produce, coming from farmers and farm aggregators. This level of concentration is thought to suppress processor activity because their cost putting product on retail shelves are higher than other jurisdictions. It's also having a negative impact on independent retailers in more remote locations that are having trouble accessing sufficient supply to meet the community needs because suppliers will supply the big 5 first when faced with shortages. Farmers are selling wholesale at prices substantially below retail prices, and these wholesale prices are generally suppressed by these levels of corporate concentration. This reality partly explains the appeal of direct marketing, because selling wholesale generally requires high volume movement of goods, often at a lower quality, and to maintain farm viability. Farmers and consumers both suffer as a result of corporate concentration. And the solution is twofold: limiting the power of corporations and providing avenues to build the power of farmers through collective marketing agencies. Supply management has effectively limited corporate power in sectors like dairy and poultry. Marketing boards have the authority to ensure prices reflect the cost of production. A recent example of corporate concentration is the Bunge-Viterra merger. Bunge was the world's 5th largest grain company, and Viterra Canada's largest grain company. 4 prairie farm organizations commissioned agricultural economists to do an in-depth study of the merger's impacts on farmers. Their report concluded that it would reduce farmers' incomes by $770 million per year. Canada needs to address the excessive concentration of ownership in the agriculture and food sector, where monopolistic behavior has become the rule rather than the exception. Our antitrust competition framework has proven inadequate, as seen by the approval of Bunge's takeover of Viterra. The NFU presented our concerns to both the Canadian and European parliaments, but the merger was completed in July of this year. Throughout our history, the NFU has been concerned with the power imbalance between the large-scale corporations that farmers deal with and the individual farmer. Our experience during the pandemic and global conflict has taught us that large corporations across the supply chain are willing to use their outsized market power to increase their own profits at the expense of farmers, workers, and consumers alike. This image is from our 2022 National Convention confronting concentration, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but along the side of the can, it says ingredients contains grassroots democracy. When we think of international trade, we probably think of the buying and selling of goods between countries, and that's true. However, all of that trade is subject to regulation and restriction depending on which countries Canada is trading with. It's important to differentiate between trade as an economic activity, the theory of free trade, and trade agreements. Trade is a normal and necessary part of all societies. The theory of free trade was advanced by certain 19th century philosophers who advocated for nations to specialize and trade goods they could produce more cheaply. International trade creates rules for governments that often go well beyond trade, and which limit democratic sovereignty over a wide range of important economic matters. Free trade is theoretically a good thing, since trade networks are needed in a world where natural resources are not distributed evenly. The problem with free trade in the current economy is that it's generally a nice way of saying that more industrialized nations exploit the resources of less industrialized nations. The NFU is a vocal critic and opponent of trade deals and investment agreements. These deals fail to address questions of Canada's real economic goals, purpose, and direction in terms of greater social participation, equality, and the pursuit of peace, both domestically and globally. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about our current trade deals. I'm going to start with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was agreed by the Canada, the United States, and Mexico in 1992. It covered trade rules on a variety of goods, including agriculture and food safety, government procurement, and how to handle trade disputes. NAFTA was the first of its kind in several ways and was the template for dozens of other agreements. Each of the trade deals that followed included additional elements that strengthened corporations' ability to move production and investments in all participating countries. The US food system is deeply dependent on immigrant labor, particularly fruit, vegetable, and dairy production and meat processing. According to the Farm Bureau, the US agriculture relies on an estimated 1.5 to 2 billion farm workers, with 50 to 70% of those folks being undocumented. While the proponents of NAFTA argued that it would improve the economic conditions in Mexico and reduce the movement of immigrants from Mexico to the US, the exact opposite occurred. Mexico almost achieved food sovereignty in the 1970s, but lost it definitively in 1989 after Salinas unilaterally opened the country to international trade. Even though Mexico produces large amounts of fresh fruit and vegetables, they are inaccessible to many working-class Mexicans, mostly because of ever larger percentage of those products grown in Mexico are destined for foreign markets, like our grocery stores. Since NAFTA, there has been a dramatic increase in agribusiness market share concentration in nearly all sectors, including seeds, fertilizer, meat, and crop production. NAFTA was superseded by CUSMA in 2018. The trends in agriculture post-NAFTA very clearly show the loss of small and medium-scale farms, the rapid expansion of concentrated animal feeding operations, contract production in the meat and poultry sector, and the growing power of multinational agribusiness firms across the North American market. CUSMA is the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. It has the same purpose as NAFTA, to eliminate rules that interfere with cross-border commercial activity and to craft laws that facilitate these activities according to the Canadian Union Unifor. In other words, the purpose of this agreement is to provide profit-making opportunities for large corporations, the same purpose that led to the disastrous results of the last one. It was created in 2017 after renegotiations of NAFTA behind closed doors. While negotiations were underway, the NFU joined with people's organizations from Canada, Mexico, and the United States in trinational meetings, where the groups called for a new model of discussions that guarantees agreements to be negotiated with the democratic participation of society, is transparent in all of its terms and conditions, and promotes the reconstruction of national, regional, and local food production chains. In addition, it must guarantee decent work and living wages, irrespective of national origin or migratory status. CUSMA not only falls short of these criteria, it undermines and weakens the foundations of justice and equity in all three countries. It is particularly harmful to Canada's supply management system and our quality control institutions for grain. Now, I'm going to interrupt myself here for a moment and take, as an aside, a minute to talk about the creation of corn. My grandmother grew up in Illinois on a corn farm, and I have a deep affinity for corn partly because of that. It was incredible to her before she passed away 10 years ago that we were growing corn in Carleton County, her adopted home. My favorite food is popcorn, which I can no longer eat due to my Crohn's disease. But the story of corn is incredible, and I don't think it's an understatement to say that it is one of the most amazing achievements humans have done with one of the most far-reaching impacts. Logan Kistler, curator of archaeoeconomics and archaeobotany at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, says domestication, the evolution of wild plants over thousands of years into the crops that feed us today, is arguably the most significant process in human history, and maize is one of the most important crops currently grown on the planet. 9,000 years ago, corn as we know it today did not exist. Ancient indigenous peoples in southwestern Mexico encountered a wild grass called teosinte that had ears smaller than a pinky finger with just a handful of stony kernels. By a stroke of genius, these indigenous cultivators saw potential in the grain, adding it to their diets, shaping it, and putting it on a path to become a domesticated crop that now feeds billions. And despite how vital corn or maize is to modern life, gaps remain in the understanding of its domestication, selection, and knowledge people had almost 10,000 years ago. It was so incredible that for centuries, scientists did not believe it was a domesticated crop. This is also in part to racial and modern prejudices of ancient peoples, but it was believed to be domesticated from a now extinct wild maize, and it's actually thanks to DNA research we know that's not true. The other thing that is incredible about corn is how completely ubiquitous it is. So, quiz question for you to consider: what percentage of edible corn grown for human consumption, whether fresh, frozen, or canned, do you think is grown in Canada? What percentage do you think we grow to eat? It's just over 1% and has been just over 1% for about 30 years or more. The majority of corn is grown for silage, animal fodder, and industrial products like corn oil, corn starch, corn syrup, and ethanol. If you go to a grocery store, most products either contain a corn derivative or are manufactured using corn derivatives, even the building itself and the vehicle that brought you there. If you'd like to learn more about this, I recommend the books The Story of Corn by Betty Fussell or The Secret History of Food by Matt Siegel, both of which are available from the New Brunswick Public Library Service. And this photo shows you a teosinte, a piece of teosinte on a piece of modern corn. So as an example of how international trade and trade deals affect food sovereignty, I want to talk about the Mexican genetically modified corn dispute, hence the corn discourse. In 2023, a presidential decree disallowed the use of genetically modified corn in Mexico for making traditional foods such as tortilla that rely on minimally processed white corn flour. The decree also states the intention to eventually replace GM corn ingredients in processed foods with non-GM corn. These measures are the result of decades of struggle by farmers and grassroots communities in Mexico who oppose the use of genetic modification and are asserting their right to seed and food sovereignty. Because corn, as we now know, was developed from an ancient plant called teosinte by indigenous peoples over thousands of years, it makes Mexico the crop's biological and cultural center of origin. Corn is a staple of Mexican cuisine, and cultivating corn provides a livelihood for Mexican farmers. Corn's significance for Mexico cannot be overstated. Mexico is the world center of diversity for corn, and it is central to Mexican culture and agriculture, history, and national identity. Corn is sacred to indigenous peoples in Mexico and essential to indigenous cultural and spiritual practice. Mexico also announced a ban on importation of GM white corn for human consumption, which could otherwise replace traditional corn in the countryside and in people's diets. The US disputed the original decree under CUSMA. The NFU urged Canada to stay out of this dispute because Mexico put these measures in place in order to uphold its food sovereignty, including the traditional Indigenous farming systems known as MILPA. In Canada, we call this the Three Sisters, which is the practice of intercropping corn, squash, and beans for soil health, plant health, and pest management. MILPA incorporates biodiversity and social and cultural traditions with deep significance. The NFU believes it would also be inconsistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for Canada to engage in a trade dispute to counter Mexico's right to protect Indigenous peoples' food and agricultural heritage. Last year, a trade dispute panel ruled against Mexico's restrictions on the use of GM corn, siding with the US and Canada, enforcing Mexico to allow the use of GM corn for food. The panel decision did not assess the scientific evidence on GM corn provided by Mexico, but concluded that Mexico did not conduct a risk assessment that conforms to the terms of the trade agreement, though it maintains that the restrictions are in line with the principles of public health and the rights of Indigenous peoples, established in national legislation and in the international treaties to which it is party. Mexico's ban on the cultivation of GM corn in order to protect native corn from GM contamination was not challenged and remains in effect. Mexico's GM corn policy was clearly meant to achieve several goals at once, such as supporting biodiversity, cultural diversity, food sovereignty, Indigenous peoples' rights, public health, and economic development, says Stuart True, senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He continues, "It is disingenuous for the trade panel to claim the policy is a disguised restriction on trade simply because it may affect imports of US or Canadian corn. But doing so conveniently allowed the panel to sidestep Mexico's strong defense of the GM corn restrictions based on environmental and Indigenous peoples' rights exceptions in CUSMA. Canada does not export any corn to Mexico. Yet the Canadian government said, quote, to secure a future for genetically modified organisms in Canada and to prevent trade disruptions due to illegal GMO contamination, product developers need access to all markets." Rick Arnold of Trade Justice in a chapter of the Council of Canadians said, "Mexico presented considerable scientific evidence on the risks of eating GM corn and should have the right to make decisions based on their concerns. Canada is not interested in the rigorous science since it recently surrendered government oversights of GM food safety to the biotechnology companies themselves. This outcome demonstrates how free trade agreements can be used to overthrow democratic decisions for corporate interest." Okay, our next trade agreement is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as CPTPP. It is between Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, Singapore, the USA, Australia, Malaysia, Mexico, Peru, Vietnam, Canada, Japan, and the United Kingdom. However, the US did withdraw in 2016, so this map is up to date of the countries involved. Trade deals like this one are only superficially about trade. They are ultimately designed to limit the authority of national governments over their own economies and to expand the scope and power of multinational corporations. These deals contain ratchet mechanisms, such as the investor-state dispute settlement. This was a highly controversial provision of NAFTA, which extends the rights of corporations to sue governments. It has come under widespread criticism from civil society organizations in all three NAFTA countries. CPTPP market concessions add on to those previously given through the WTO and CETA. Each has chipped away at the Canadian farmers' share of our own domestic market by increasing the amount of tariff-free imports allowed. CPTPP also required all countries to join the Global Seed Breeders Treaty, which is known as UPOV 91, which prevents farmers and breeders from sharing seeds while empowering global seed companies like Monsanto and Syngenta. Our final trade deal is the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA. The European Union is one of the largest economies in the world and was Canada's second largest trading partner. It was ratified in 2017. It's worth noting that the EU subsidizes its farmers and Canada does not. The EU spends over $50 billion a year on agricultural subsidies. And Canada's agricultural ministers have repeatedly stated that farmers should get their income from the marketplace, so it's unlikely Canadian farmers will ever get European-style subsidies. The benefits of CETA to agriculture that were touted by the federal government are unlikely to materialize because Europe has exempted its regulations around GMO crops from CETA, meaning that Canadian farmers who use GMO technology will not gain access to the European market through CETA. Europe has also elected to pay penalties under the WTO in order to avoid importing Canadian beef that has been produced using growth hormones. Okay, we will now move to local food and New Brunswick food system. A lot of the information I'm going to talk about on this slide comes from the Census of Agriculture, which happens every 5 years. It's a fairly accurate picture. Where I think we have issues capturing correct information is around gender in farming, as most often men in households register the business in their name, even if their partner or spouse equally contributes to the farm, and it skews that data, so I haven't included it. There are about 200 farms in the province, although that number continues to decline. And in the last census period, which was 2016 to 2021, we saw an 18% decline in total number of farms, and more than 80% of that decline was small-scale farms. There are over 50 commodities produced in the province, everything from fruit and vegetable production, beekeeping, livestock, even fur farming. Most commodities have a commodity group who also look after their specific interests. Agriculture employs just under 10,000 people in the province in both primary production and processing. Primary production is a farm producing one or more types of products sold to consumers or processors. Processing or secondary production transforms those primary products into things like jam, craft alcohol, or chips. Labor is a significant challenge for farmers, and many have adapted to using machinery or growing certain crops that reduce the need of seasonal or full-time labor. With Agriculture NB, we have a shared workforce pilot that provides workers to farms for any length of time, right now in 9 different commodities, with more being added every year. Last year, we matched 200 job seekers with 20 farm operations. There were about 277,363 hectares of farmland in New Brunswick in the 2021 census, but total farmland also declined 18% from 2016 to 2021 and has likely further declined since. This was only about 3.9% of the province of New Brunswick. And for context, it's a little bigger than the European country of Luxembourg, a little smaller than the whole of PEI. Farmers on average are about 57 years old, and we are already starting to see the effects of this aging population on farm numbers and farmland decline. We really need more young farmers. New Brunswick households spent approximately $2.8 billion on food in 2023, which was about a 16.9% increase from 2021. Much of that food is produced outside of the province. And just taking a minute to say that retail food prices are rising. And to explain these increases, many commentators and critics point to rising prices for farm products and cite drought and other production problems, the pandemic or supply chain issues. This is not really an accurate explanation. Data shows that corporate food processors and retailers have relentlessly, for decades, pushed up retail prices, even as the prices paid to farmers remained the same. And if you are interested in finding independent grocers or food access points, I would recommend checking out the Alt Grocery website. We've worked with them in the past. Food insecurity is rising across the country. 29.5% of people in New Brunswick are food insecure, with the highest rates of insecurity being on First Nations reserves. This is up from 2022 in 2021, or sorry, this is up from 22% in 2021. We were the third most food insecure province in 2021, but the rates of food insecurity have shot up so much in other provinces that we've actually moved to fourth place, despite our increase in our own province. New Brunswick's supply vastly outpaces demand within the province for the commodities that we export. We overproduce between 400% and 2,000% of the potatoes, wild blueberries, seafood, maple syrup, and cranberries that we eat. And we are far from self-sufficient in the production of vegetables, fruit, beef, pork, and grains. Now, we do have a shorter growing season, which affects this, but so does the export-focused market and our reliance on cheaper imports. These low rates of self-sufficiency numbers suggest there is an opportunity to grow the volumes produced in these primary sectors and move them towards local markets and processing. Agriculture, agri-food, and beverage production accounts for 3.5% of the provincial GDP. Now, if we add fishing and seafood production, the entire food economy accounts for 5.5% of provincial GDP. This is higher than the forest products sector, which accounts for 4.3% of provincial GDP. And yet, in our 2025 budget, the forestry sector within the Department of Natural Resources and Energy Development received $7.4 million, and the entire Department of Agriculture, Aquaculture, and Fisheries received $715,000. Okay, I'm really going to dive into farm income because this is where the NFU does a lot of our work and analysis. This graph compares gross farm revenue and realized net income in millions of dollars. These figures have been adjusted for inflation, and government subsidies have been subtracted. Gross farm income, or farm cash receipts, is the money that farmers earn when they sell their products, which is the black line. Realized net farm income is what farmers keep after they pay their bills, the gray line. In the last 50 years, the gap between gross revenue and realized net income has grown at an alarming rate. In New Brunswick, from the end of the Depression to the mid-80s, farmers were keeping almost half of every dollar they produced. From the mid-80s until now, the farmer's share after they pay their bills is about 7%. In 2024, despite record-breaking farm cash receipts, you can literally see that line going off the chart. The realized net farm income of New Brunswick farmers was negative 1%. They paid to farm last year. Canadian farm debt has also doubled since the year 2000, and the majority of farm family household income comes from off-farm work. Over 65% of farms rely on off-farm income. And this gap that we see, it represents farmers' costs. The money they give to those machinery companies, fertilizer companies, fuel companies, chemical companies, banks, etc. And key to our analysis is that farmers have been pushed and pressured to be overly reliant on purchased inputs. As they've become reliant on these purchased inputs, more of the wealth they create has been siphoned off. Industrial agriculture requires the use of inputs like chemicals and factory-made fertilizer, hybrid seeds, more and larger equipment, and constant investment or loans. This high input, high output model is empowered by agribusinesses and corporations, forcing many farmers to specialize instead of diversify and to increase scale every year, to export more and more goods, rather than growing crops that feed hungry people. If we reduce farm input use, we can increase net farm income, but also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Because farming does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. Agricultural inputs produce greenhouse gas emissions. We recognize the large-scale farms aren't just going to disappear, but we believe the small and medium-scale farms are the future of food. They are the most adaptable and the lowest input. A much more detailed analysis of farm income and climate change can be found in our 2019 report, Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis. It's available at nfu.ca. We also strongly advocate for a universal basic income for all, which in addition to helping the farm income crisis, could reduce farm debt and increase the local buying power of consumers. Climate change and weather. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because climate change is affecting all aspects of our food system. Livia Campesina has noted that the expansion of the agricultural frontier through factory farms and monoculture fields accounts for 70 to 90% of global deforestation, at least half of that for the production of a few agricultural commodities for export. Farmers, as you know, are at the mercy of the weather. And with climate change, farmers are struggling to deal with continued warming, more intense storms, and increasingly unpredictable and extreme weather like drought and wildfires in New Brunswick this year. This is a photo of the Grove Orchard and U-Pick in Warren Grove, PEI, after Hurricane Fiona. New Brunswick was very lucky. This was a near miss for us, and we will not always be that lucky. Our low realized net income, our declining farm numbers, and the loss of farmland make adapting to and managing extreme weather more difficult. We need better emergency preparedness measures that are tailored for farms. A note on mental health. Across Canada, farmers are experiencing declining mental health. Producers have higher rates of stress, depression, and anxiety compared to the general population. The issue is so pervasive that it has been described as a mental health crisis. And with our Agriculture-NB partners, who are the Agricultural Alliance of New Brunswick and Really Local Harvest, we launched Farm Talk Care, a mental health and farm safety program for New Brunswick farmers, farm workers, and their families. Each word represents a different state of mental health and can be used as a self-identification tool for the level you are at. So farm is maintaining mental health and wellness. Talk is experiencing mild to moderate symptoms and signs of distress, and care is at risk for developing a mental illness and needing help. With this program, we've developed a peer support network of farmers helping farmers, and next week we are just about to officially launch our Farmer Wellness Program, which offers confidential, no-cost counseling delivered by professional counselors who understand rural and agricultural life and the unique stressors faced by those working in this industry. Each participant can access up to 4 counseling sessions per year. The other piece about mental health I want to mention is addressing the upstream causes. In 2023, the NFU and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives released the report Field Notes, looking upstream at the farmer mental health crisis in Canada. This research found that at the heart of the farmer mental health crisis is pervasive economic uncertainty and precarity. Unfettered corporate concentration in the food sector, consolidation and financialization of farmland, climate change, and trade liberalization are key factors contributing to the economic precarity of farmers and farm workers. Additional contributing factors include economic and knowledge barriers to farming, intensified social polarization within rural communities, racism and violence against women. Burnout and lack of ancillary and core healthcare services were also noted as contributors to stress. At its core, this report argues that meaningful action is needed at the policy level to improve the living and working conditions of Canadian farmers. A comprehensive approach that considers the upstream drivers of farmer mental health will help foster a more resilient and sustainable agricultural sector while improving the well-being of farmers across Canada. Let's talk about local procurement for a minute. I'm going to say this is a photo from a New Brunswick hospital. I unfortunately have significant experience of this food. That is oatmeal in the brown container, and that oatmeal is the vilest substance known to humanity. Local procurement is when local products are purchased for use in public institutions like hospitals. New Brunswick's procurement policies are completely hidden from industry and the public. We have no idea how much food is being locally procured. Often when we suggest increasing local procurement, the immediate response is that this would be protectionist behavior. Protectionism is an economic policy of governments to restrict imports and to protect its domestic industries from foreign competition, using tools like tariffs, quotas, and subsidies. Sound familiar? Yes, supply management is a protectionist policy. However, supply management only covers a part of our food chain. We need strengthened procurement programs and policies to increase the amount of healthy, local, and sustainable food served in public institutions. This would redirect institutions' funding for food into local economies and strengthen the local food system. On an annual basis, millions of dollars are spent on food for publicly funded facilities, including hospitals, long-term care facilities, universities, school cafeterias, etc. As mentioned, hospital food is notoriously bad, and it doesn't help that nothing in New Brunswick hospitals is cooked in New Brunswick except for toast. Everything is brought in from another province and reheated. Back to food sovereignty. We embrace the core values of food sovereignty as articulated by La Via Campesina in the Declaration of Nieleni and as outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other Peoples Working in Rural Areas. These foundational documents include the following global justice principles. Food is for people, not profit. Value and respect food providers and their rights, localize food systems and implement fair and just trade policies, localize control over all aspects of food systems, territory, water, seeds, markets, knowledge, technology, build and support traditional and Indigenous knowledge and skills, and work in harmony with the non-human world. Building meaningful and long-term solidarity with Indigenous peoples and migrant workers is central to our work. In 2015, our International Programs Committee established the NFU's Indigenous Solidarity Working Group to deepen our commitment to challenging settler colonialism and affirming Indigenous food sovereignty and rematriation. In 2017, we established the NFU's Migrant Worker Solidarity Working Group to fight for systemic change, taking the lead from migrant justice organizations in Canada advocating for permanent resident status for all. Nettie Wiebe, former NFU president, was involved at the formation of La Via Campesina and the articulation of its aims. She says, I recall long, profound, sometimes contentious discussions going late into the night as we struggled to find a term that would capture what we were fighting for. The conventional term of food security was inadequate. This was about more than producing more food or distributing it more efficiently. We were grappling with the fundamental questions of power and democracy. Who controls food-producing resources such as land, water, seeds, and genetics, and for what purpose? Who gets to decide what is grown, how and where it is grown, and for whom? we needed to have language that expressed the political dimensions of our struggle. Food sovereignty is such a term. It provokes the necessary discourse about power, freedom, democracy, equality, justice, sustainability, and culture. Food is taken out of the realm of being primarily a market commodity and re-embedded in the social, ecological, cultural, and local contexts as a source of nutrition, livelihood, meaning, and relationships. In 2007, the NFU participated in the historic Nielani International Forum on Food Sovereignty in Mali, where 500 members of La Via Campesina organizations from 80 countries came together to build a global movement for food sovereignty. The forum participants further refined their understanding of this new paradigm of food and agriculture in the Nielani Declaration. And what you're seeing on screen is an excerpt from that declaration. It has just been reaffirmed in Sri Lanka, and several of our NFU Canada members attended. Touching on farmland, it's fundamental to agriculture, no surprise to anyone. But who own it and how it is tended are critical. More than half of Canada's best agricultural land and 1/3 of our second best land is within a 50-mile radius of the country's largest cities. Urban and industrial sprawl encroaches yearly on highly productive farmland. With proper study and consideration of the soil types and best use of land around urban centers, development could occur in the same general vicinity without destroying agricultural land. As the cost of land rises, the cost of production automatically increases, and therefore the cost of food. As land value rises, it becomes more difficult for new and young farmers to enter farming. Farmland is an invaluable gift from past generations that comes with the responsibility to steward it for generations yet to come. Farmers and rural communities across Canada need support to achieve food sovereignty and address the multiple threats to farmland access and soil health. Agroecology, I've mentioned a few times, it's a holistic approach to food production that uses and creates social, cultural, economic, and environmental knowledge to promote food sovereignty, social justice, economic sustainability, and healthy agricultural ecosystems. Agroecology is much more than a set of technologies. It's a political and social system, a way of life, a form of resistance against corporate control, and quite simply the only means of achieving food sovereignty. Ultimately, agroecology means bringing agriculture back into harmony with human ecology, including our biology, our environment, and our cultural and political structures. And I think this is a great graph that illustrates the difference between an agricultural food system, an agroecological food system and an industrial food system, and really where the money goes and how. Okay, we're going to take a minute to talk about tariffs, inevitably, with international trade. I'm going to give you a very high-level overview of the situation because honestly, I'm not sure that there are more than a handful of people on the planet who actually know what's going on. A tariff is a duty or tax imposed by a government on imported or exported goods, including agricultural products. Tariffs are a common tool in international trade used to regulate the flow of goods between countries and influence domestic markets. Typically, tariffs are paid by the importing country or firm who are receiving the goods. I couldn't resist using this political cartoon, even though when I scanned it, the actual paper that it was in didn't flatten totally. So a brief recap of the situation. In February, the US announced 25% tariffs on all goods from Mexico and Canada. Canada immediately retaliated by imposing 25% tariffs on US exports. Canada said that US liquor and vegetables would be among the first products to receive retaliatory tariffs, and that this tariff imposition violated CUSMA. A 1-month delay was announced a few days later, and then on March 4th, tariffs and retaliatory tariffs went into effect. On March 7th, The US threatened 250% tariffs on Canadian lumber and dairy products. They said that Canada, quote, must immediately drop their anti-American farmer tariff of 250% to 390% on various US dairy products, unquote. Canada's tariff rate quota on US dairy products allows a certain amount of US dairy products to enter the country without facing tariffs, and high tariffs only being imposed if the imports surpass a certain amount, as we discussed in supply management. Since US dairy exports to Canada have never actually exceeded the quota, the Canadian tariffs have never been activated. In April, Canada announced several measures to provide relief from tariffs, including a 6-month pause on tariffs for goods imported from the US to be used in Canadian manufacturing and processing and food and beverage packaging, among other things. But really, since then, tariffs have flipped back and forth off and on. The trade war increased support for removing trade barriers between provinces and affected the outcome of the Canadian federal election. The imposition and rollback of tariffs has created uncertainty for many businesses and has led to an erosion of international confidence in the US as a reliable trading partner. Imposed, threatened, and retaliatory tariffs violate Canadian sovereignty and the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples, cause market instability and unpredictable market situation, and result in direct losses in farm income, as well as uncertainty over plans for future production seasons. So in this case, they were more than an economic tool and became a rallying point for asserting Canada's sovereignty and independence. I'm not going to get into the Chinese canola tariff and anti-dumping investigation, but there is a really great policy brief on the NFU website if anyone wants to learn more about that. Livia Campesina firmly believes that when applied with good intent and supported by appropriate public services, tariffs can be powerful tools to support small-scale food producers, improve food availability, create jobs, and strengthen food sovereignty. However, these tools are increasingly being co-opted by governments with vested interests to protect transnational corporations, expand market dominance, and assert geopolitical power. The WTO efforts to eliminate tariffs on agriculture have intensified corporate control over food production by creating low barriers for global trade and providing massive subsidies to agribusinesses at home. In industrialized countries, this has exacerbated rural poverty and food insecurity. Tariff liberalization supports extractive fossil fuel production models, often usurping land, water, and territories that people have been using for generations to cultivate food. So, starting to wrap this up, what is our long-term vision for our food systems? Under the neoliberal dogma, the goal for governments is to make their export commodities more competitive in global markets. This is contradictory to the objectives of building food sovereignty. In an export-driven economy, governments often impose tariffs to boost agro-industries that focus on international commodity sales, often produced through environmentally harmful monoculture farming, rather than strengthening domestic agroecological food production. Here are a few ways over the years NFU members have cultivated food sovereignty, and you can too. Growing healthy and culturally appropriate food for communities, advocating for and supporting local and regional scale processing, storage, distribution to bolster domestic markets, building soil health and reducing our on-farm carbon footprint, defending the rights of agricultural workers to fair wages and safe working conditions, standing up for migrant workers by joining calls for their full labor rights, open work permits, and a pathway to citizenship, affirming Indigenous rights and sovereignty, especially the rights to refuse consent for unwanted mega projects, and defending Canada's unique supply management system that keeps food dollars and decision-making power in the farmers' hands. What can we do in New Brunswick? Through our day-to-day work as farmers and by organizing in our communities to create a more just food system, NFU members and our international allies resist corporate monopolies, trade regimes, and other imperialist power grabs that constrain sovereignty, rob farmers and peasants of their livelihoods, grab control over lands and water, fuel violence and war, and criminalize resistance. We believe food cannot be a weapon of war and condemn the genocide in Palestine, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, and Ukraine. Krista, I see you. I'm almost done. In New Brunswick, we can encourage Indigenous stewardship in all levels of government. We can protect farmland by creating policies at all levels of government that protect prime farmland from development and suburban sprawl. We can use season extension and controlled environment technologies to our benefit and not our detriment. We also need to rethink how we're using our land and encouraging and supporting cooperative farming models and using more public lands to grow food. We need to adopt agroecology. We also need to buy local wherever and whenever we are able. Many people have probably already started checking their labels of where your food comes from, but other ideas are going to your farmers markets more. We have 46 in New Brunswick, buying more meat, veggies, eggs, honey directly from your farmers or butchers, signing up for a CSA, a community shared agriculture program, or if you have the capacity, preserving your local food to last over the winter by freezing, canning, and dehydrating. And finally, local procurement policies. We need better and more transparent procurement policies. Before I let you go, I'm just going to take 1 minute to tell you about how you can learn more about the NFU and participate in our work. We are hosting our national convention for the first time in the history of the Union in New Brunswick in November 19th, 20th, and 21st in Moncton. It is a lot of organizational business, but it is open to everyone. Our keynote speakers this year are Charlie Angus and Britt Griffin. And Thursday evening, we'll be having La Famille Leblanc providing music and entertainment. You can register at nfu.ca. You can also become a member. We have different membership levels for farmers, farm workers, youth, BIPOC folks, and an associate membership for those who don't farm but want to support our work. If you want to join, call or email me and I'll talk you through your options. And my final request is to sign our petition. So Canada's Plant Breeders' Rights Act gives plant breeders exclusive rights to produce and reproduce new varieties for 20 years. When farmers buy these varieties, they pay for the seed itself and a royalty to the breeder for the right to use the variety. This act has a clause called farmer's privilege, which permits farmers to grow future crops on their own holdings with saved seeds, cuttings, tubers, etc., from a new plant variety in future years without paying further royalties. The government is proposing a regulatory change that would narrow the farmer's privilege clause by eliminating its application to new varieties of fruits, vegetables, ornamentals, and hybrids. Farmers using these varieties would be forced to buy and pay royalties every single year and will not be allowed to save their seed. It's a direct threat to food security, seed sovereignty, and farmer autonomy. We must stop this restriction of farmers' privilege, and I will put our parliamentary petition in the chat. And that is everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. What a great presentation. I really appreciate, trade is such a big topic, and I really appreciate you taking the time to break that down and to give us an idea of just some of these different policies and things that play into trade, and to help us be able to, do more research and continue to educate ourselves following this event too. We still have a few minutes left, so I do want to open up the floor for questions. Just a reminder that we are recording and uploading the video to YouTube. So if you unmute to ask your question and you have your video on, you will be part of our recording. But you can keep your camera off or also put things in the chat if you don't want to show up on YouTube later while we ask questions. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions for Suzanne? I think I see Kristen's hand. Kristen, do you want to go?
Sure, you guys can hear me? Vous m'entendez?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Suzanne. I mean, at some moments, I'll be honest, I felt like it was a bit over my head, but I appreciate the knowledge that you're sharing with us. It's very, very precious. Question that I have for you. You mentioned policies. And I was thinking as I work for a regional service commission, I was curious to know from a municipal standpoint, that what sort of policies would be, in your opinion, policies that could be put in place that would be very helpful to with the interest of food sovereignty, I guess in general. Are there any that come to mind or
Yeah, I mean, the number one policy that I think municipal and local governments can affect is that protecting farmland piece. And our youth president, Alexis Legier, is sitting on an agriculture committee, I think in the Acadian Rural Regional Service Commission, where they are very actively working to identify where their prime agricultural land is in their area and enact bylaws or legislation to protect it as farmland for future use. We're going to need more of that. And I mean, I'm completely realistic that at some level, we are dictating what people can do with their property, but our rates of food insecurity are so high and our loss of farmland is so high that this is going to become necessary for sure.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Kristen. Are there other questions for Suzanne? If I'd like to ask a question. What's a common myth about local food, Suzanne, that you would like to bust?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, there's a couple of things. I think the one of the biggest ones is the public perception around agriculture and that it is backbreaking day in, day out labor. And certainly that can be true. But there are so many options in the agricultural sector for different jobs if you don't want to actually farm. But also, we have tools and methods and systems that reduce that requirement for, manual labor on farms. Obviously, depends on the scale and the type of commodity you're growing, but I think there is still a real perception that it's just hard work. I think there is also, a misconception around what it is as a career. And, certainly a lot of farming is a lifestyle choice. And, it's not, especially if you have livestock, easy to take a vacation, for example. But I know we have been fighting against, the school system actively demoting agriculture as an option for students. It's not considered a viable career, and I would definitely say that that's not true, even though we definitely have lots of policy issues that we need put in place to really make that viable in the long term.
I imagine too, just to build on that, Suzanne, that with the chart that you showed us where farmers paid to farm, I was that this last year, that's got to be difficult too for youth looking at that as a viable career option as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, especially when you look at commodities like fruit, tree production that require 5 to 10 years of time in order to get those crops established before you have any return on your investment. Absolutely. It's very, very hard for someone who doesn't come from a farming background or inherit farmland or infrastructure to start a farm without taking on a huge amount of debt. I see Peo's question in the chat. What is the fair trade policy or system for the NFU under neoliberal capitalism? Peo, and the fascist colonial state apparatus and commodity form as the paradigm for modern social relation. I don't know if I'm the right person to answer this. I mean, I do think there, La Via Campesina certainly operates and understands that there is a possibility of just trade. And, I'm not sure exactly what that would be called or what it would look like. I think it comes back to that idea of using tariffs, for the benefit of small scale producers. And, building food sovereignty into all of our policy levels. But you and I can talk more about that.
Are there other questions from the floor for Suzanne? I know you talked a little bit about this, Suzanne, but I'm wondering just if you were to kind of summarize this into a key point or two for us, what are the current obstacles to having local food be a bigger part of our local food system? Like if we were to take all the things you kind of talked about and like distill it down into some simple points to take away for today, what would you say for us?
Number one is corporate concentration in Canada. We have companies actively profiteering. They are making such money off of the backs of Canadian consumers and farmers. And that makes it very, very hard for people to earn farm income, as we talked about, that is stable without falling into the trap of industrialized agricultural production at a huge scale, focused on an export market, focused on a monoculture or a specific crop. So I mean, there are huge downward pressure from our system that puts on our farmers in order to adapt to the way that they want them to work. But that also goes hand in hand, with the needing farmland. I mean, we can't have farms without land to farm on. And, especially at our New Brunswick scale, I would never advocate for plowing in all of our forests to build farms. That's unrealistic. But we are losing too much of our prime land that we already have.
Thank you. We're getting right near the end. So if anyone had one last question that they've been sitting on, this is your last chance. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our What the Food webinar. Before we say goodbye, I want to say a huge thank you to the Department of Health and to Medavie Foundation, who are our funding partners. And thank you to our host organization, United Way Maritimes. Also to our fabulous interpreters, Safia and Jules, for their interpretation services today. And our lovely volunteer, Marie-Ève Brideau, who helped us record this event as a volunteer and friend of Food for All. And of course, a big thank you to Suzanne for an excellent presentation and for your time answering questions. And all of you for being here today. It's great to be able to share these opportunities to learn and expand our knowledge together. In the chat, we've shared a link to a short survey. We'd love your feedback on today's event. It helps us to plan good events that are useful to you, so your feedback is greatly appreciated. And we'll be sending everyone the recording and survey link again via email soon. We generally aim to get an email out within a week of the presentations. In October, we'll be welcoming Eric Chevrier as our speaker for an event called What If We Had Food Sovereign Campuses? Eric is a researcher, activist, and professor at Concordia University. He'll teach us about the role of campus community food systems within the global food system and how to build food sovereignty on campus. The registration link is also in the chat on our website and on social media, so you can't miss it. Please feel free to share widely, especially with your friends who are students, professors, or connected to campuses in any way. So I really hope to see you all again for our next presentation. And before we close, just is there any last word or message you want to leave us with, Suzanne?
Final word, the only way that you know you are buying a Canadian product is if you buy it directly from your farmer. So please buy from your farmers directly.
I love that as a final word to end on. Thank you so much for being here. Everyone, have a wonderful end of your day. Until next time, bye-bye.